Good afternoon. In our first meeting, I tried to indicate the scope of this survey of European art, its structure, my approach, and what I hope we will accomplish in these 48 lectures. We're about to begin our survey, and I'm ready if you are. I've chosen to begin the survey, historically, with Charlemagne and his coronation as emperor by Pope Leo III in Rome on Christmas Day, 800. The reason for this choice is that the event is a convenient marker for the beginning of a centralized political power for the first time in Europe since the dissolution of the Roman Empire in the West in 476. The Germanic tribes known as the Franks had moved into Roman Gaul, replacing the last of the Roman leaders, accepting Christianity, and they reached the zenith of their influence, their political influence, during what we now call the Carolingian dynasty, named for Charlemagne, who was born around 742. I don't know whether you've ever had a course that started at the beginning, and in this case, I can't resist a backward glance myself at a moment before our announced beginning. In this case, a look at the Irish missionaries of the 7th and 8th centuries and their artistic legacy. During the period following the Roman Empire, the only unifying force on the European continent was the Roman Catholic Church, whose own spread had been made possible by the astonishing Roman expansion across the continent, and into Britain, which was made possible in great part by the building of the vast network of Roman roads and aqueducts. But Christian missionaries went even further than had the Romans. Ireland, unlike England, had never been part of the Roman Empire, and the missionaries who reached Ireland in the early Middle Ages found a religiously responsive population, but one that had no perceptible interest in Roman or Mediterranean culture. When some Irish Christians, some of the new Irish Christians, sought to deepen their faith, they congregated not in the cities, but in hermit groups away from the cities, and they spread throughout Ireland and throughout Britain. These hermit communities developed into the first monasteries. And from those monasteries, Irish monks set out across Europe, preaching and founding monasteries as they went. In these Irish monasteries, in these newly founded monasteries, countless copies of the Bible and other Christian texts were produced. They were necessary to spread the faith. The scribes and the illuminators, those who decorated the manuscripts, produced, as I say, innumerable such copies. The style of their illuminations, and it's the word we use for painted decorations in manuscripts or drawings in some occasions, the style combined a style that we know as a nomadic animal style, one which had come across Europe with the nomadic tribes, the Germanic tribes, and it combined that with Celtic elements from Ireland, and it preferred this combination style. It preferred elaborate ornamental designs over pictures of biblical events. Pictorial art, narrative art was secondary. I show you what is called a carpet page, a wonderful manuscript page with a design in the shape of a cross from the famous Lindisfarne Gospels of about 700 AD, today in London in the British Museum. A complete manuscript. This is one page. These pages called carpet pages are called carpet pages for obvious reasons. They have an overall design which seems, especially to us, very similar to so-called Turkish carpets. The embellishment of this book page is staggeringly intricate. It's compressed with almost manic intensity into the smallest spaces. If you were to look at the corner, any of the corner parts of the manuscript in particular, you will see an elaborate design which consists in part of a stylized fantastic animals, snake-like bodies with bird-like beaks, and in other places animal heads. And in part, it is conceived also in circles, sweeping interlaced curves. The design at first seems mad, chaotic, and I'd go mad if I tried to produce it, but it's rigorous, it's disciplined. It suggests the finest jeweler's work. And in the sense of the patience that it took, it's a virtual demonstration of the monk's devotion, where hours and days and weeks and months were absorbed into the monastic discipline. On this page, the cross form dominates all the other elements. A clear cross form, a stylized one, but a clear cross form, dominates all of the elements of the design, as if this fierce pagan world of the animal style, which you find in the details, had been domesticated by the divine order. The Romans themselves, beginning with the Emperor Constantine, were sometimes converts to Christianity, and increasingly so. And this strengthened the Catholic presence in the Germanic and Gallic lands. Indeed, Constantine spent much time at Trier on the Mosel, a city founded by the Emperor Augustus. A short distance north of Trier, the city of Aachen, during its history sometimes also known as Aix-la-Chapelle, obviously depending upon the nationality of the ownership and language of the moment, so either Aachen in the German or Aix-la-Chapelle. Aix-la-Chapelle also incorporates the word chapel, which we'll be looking at because it's Charlemagne's chapel, and it incorporates that into the French version of its name. Aachen, as I will call it, became the capital of Charlemagne. Charlemagne means Charles the Great, or in Latin, Carolus Magnus, and it's from the Carolus that we get Carolingian. During his reign, Aachen witnessed a cultural revival in arts and letters. What survives of the visual artistic activity, however, is almost entirely in the minor or decorative arts, such as gold and other metal work, ivory carving, and the painted manuscripts. There were murals, there was relief sculpture, there were some mosaics, according to documents, but they have mostly vanished. And indeed, the palace built by Charlemagne at Aachen has vanished entirely. But his palace chapel stands as a testament to his interest in the art of the Italian peninsula. He had first visited Rome in Easter week of 774, where he very shrewdly consolidated his ties to the Roman Church by confirming its Italian territorial possessions, the basis of the papal states that would remain the source of the temporal power of the papacy until the 18th century. Charlemagne understood the political value of his alliance with Rome, with the papacy. He also made 3 subsequent military forays over the Alps for campaigns in northern Italy. These transalpine ventures added a dimension to the biography of Charlemagne, but also to the mythology of Charlemagne, one that was later invoked, as we'll see in a number of centuries, by Napoleon. On one or more of these Italian trips over a quarter of a century, Charlemagne visited Ravenna on the Adriatic coast, once an important Roman port. It was to Ravenna that the capital of the Western Empire had been moved in 402 from Rome to Ravenna as a place that was more protected from the barbarian invasions which threatened the empire so severely. And then in the mid-6th century, the Byzantine emperors had established their court in Ravenna, and the first of these emperors, Justinian, had built the church of San Vitale. San Vitale was built in 547. That at least is the date of its completion. The church is polygonal. It's quite massive outside, but inside it's distinguished by a great deal of light. And that light from higher windows, larger windows, was also reflected from some of the finest and most important and beautiful mosaics of the early Byzantine period, though some of those in the church have been destroyed. If you look, we're looking into the apse in this photograph, toward the apse or the choir and where the altar is. If you look closer, you find yourself in an area that has many beautiful mosaics, both in the cupola, the half dome above, and on either side where members of Justinian's court are arrayed. These are incredibly important and beautiful, beautiful mosaics, but they also, because of their reflective quality, increase the light, and it's a colored light in a sense, within the church. Charlemagne was obviously deeply impressed by the architecture. And of course, he was keenly aware of the symbolic significance of it as imperial architecture that he might import to the north, to Aachen. But what a difference. Here is the Palatine Chapel, Charlemagne's chapel at Aachen. 805 was the year of completion. Charlemagne and his artistic advisors had imported the ground plan, the shape of the church, and they'd actually imported actual doors and bronze doors and columns from Rome and from Ravenna for use in the palace chapel. But they seem to have had little interest in the mosaic decoration, which dominated in San Vitale, and in the quality of light that San Vitale had. And in fact, the interior of the Palatine Chapel has a massive heaviness and a darkness quite different from the insubstantial atmosphere of the reflected light and splendid color of Byzantine art as seen at San Vitale. This massive, muscular appearance is more reminiscent of Roman architecture than it is of the Byzantine architecture in Ravenna. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the Carolingian artistic revival is its persuasive recollection, if I can put it that way, of the classical style of Greco-Roman antiquity. Something that you see, for instance, in its illuminated manuscripts. This is an image of St. Matthew. In the Gospel books, of course, that were produced, so many of the Gospels were produced, and the principal illustration was always a portrait miniature of the evangelist, St. Matthew in this case, but Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John could all be shown. And here we have St. Matthew in a gospel called the Gospel Book of Charlemagne, appropriately, illustrated or illuminated, created about 800 to 810 A.D., now in Vienna, in the Kunsthistorisches Museum there. It was said to have been found in the tomb of Charlemagne in the palace chapel, whether true or not, but that was its history, and it gave it particular significance symbolically, but the artistic significance of this painting lies in the forceful, three-dimensional quality of the body as seen through, felt through, if you will, the classical robes. You see the body underneath the robes. The robes, after all, Roman robes, are only a classical, superficial classical quote by the Carolingian artist, and the pose is intentionally derived from a classical prototype, the so-called author portraits, paintings in which famous writers were shown with an open book, writing it or reading it. What impresses us here, however, is the degree to which the Carolingian artist had understood how to create a believable, solid human body. The artist does not make any attempt to suggest space beyond that occupied by the body. That area is simply flat bands of color behind the body. Even more interesting, perhaps, than this St. Matthew is another illumination, another St. Matthew, which might have been based upon the one we were just looking at, or they might share a common model, but that they're related is surely no question about it. This St. Matthew is from the so-called Gospel Book of the Archbishop Ebbo of Reims, from about 816 to 835 A.D., It's now in the library at Epernay, France, and is commonly called the Epernay Gospel. This painting represents the mature and distinctive Carolingian figure style, one which is suffused with linear movement and physical intensity. Look at those robes. Look at the linear quality of the robes, of his hair, and the tenseness of the attitude. There is an expressive urgency which often recurs, by the way, through later centuries of Northern European art. And here it is, an essential part of the Carolingian style. I want to point out before leaving it one thing that you could easily miss. At the very top, you know that St. Matthew received his inspiration to write the Gospel from an angel. And in later art, sometimes the angel is standing there dictating, sometimes whispering in his ear, sometimes writing for him. In this case, up on the hill at the top right-hand corner, tiny angel, but it's no doubt he, looking down, and from his hand, or I think we have to say into his hand, a scroll is unwinding. It connects the inkhorn held by Matthew in his left hand here, and which was basically a quote from the earlier Matthew I showed you. And it goes on up the hill and into the hand as a scroll, as a finished scroll, a finished gospel, into the hand of the inspiring angel in the upper right-hand corner. In 813, Charlemagne had selected one of his sons, known to history as Louis the Pious, to share his power as consort, really, and to succeed him. Charlemagne himself crowned Louis at Aachen, not in Rome, and without the Pope. He was arrogating the power to himself, the papal power, and I wonder if Napoleon Bonaparte, who was a keen student of history, 1,000 years later didn't have that in the back of his mind when he crowned himself emperor in the presence of the Pope who had to come to Paris. We have a nice parallel in any event. Charlemagne died a year later, the 28th of January, 814, and his son and successor, Louis, died in 840, and a war of succession broke out among the sons of Louis. The events of the next century, including raids by the Vikings, culminated in the creation of what is called the Holy Roman Empire, headed first by the German king Otto I, or Otto the Great, whose coronation as emperor in 962 established a political entity that endured until the early 19th century. Crowned at Aachen, Otto and his successors of the same name thus succeeded Charlemagne in place as in power, and the Ottos gave their name to the Ottonian period of the 10th and early 11th century. Artistically, the Ottonian period further developed the expressive style of the Carolingians, and often in a narrative direction. Perhaps the chief monument of this style is the extraordinary set of bronze doors at Hildesheim in northern Germany. The monastery at Hildesheim was headed by Bishop Bernward, a man of wide learning who made Hildesheim into a cultural center. I'm showing you the bronze doors of Hildesheim, completed in 1015 for the Abbey Church. The great doors of Hildesheim were spared the extensive destruction of the church during World War II. 20 years after the war, it was a moving experience to drive among the still war-ruined buildings of Hildesheim, up the hill to see the rebuilt church and to see the famous bronze doors. These doors are among the most memorable of the many sets of bronze doors throughout the history of art. And they represent a remarkable technical achievement. They were cast in a single piece for the first time since antiquity. I'm going to show you one panel. It is the fourth one down on the left-hand side as you are looking at the doors. You see the ranks of the scenes here, 8 in each of the valves of the door. And the fourth one down on the left shows Adam and Eve reproached by the Lord. I want you to look first at the inscription that runs beneath it, because these doors are inscribed in beautiful Roman characters, and the date in Roman numerals just below God's feet at the left is inscribed 1015. MXV. This single panel of the bronze doors demonstrates this anonymous artist's extraordinary achievement. Here are Adam and Eve, after the fall, accused, found guilty, and about to be cast out of paradise. It is the succinct embodiment of Paradise Lost, and it has a visual impact worth hundreds of words. I want to describe it. I want to start with the figure of God standing at the left, the Lord who's come into the garden to confront Adam and Eve. And I want you to look at his drapery, first of all, at the clothes, because it is remarkable once again, in its classical understanding. The way the robes, specifically in this case, reveal the legs of God. They're almost wind-blown. You get the feeling that the wind has blown the cloth back against his legs, but you see the legs, and the folds themselves have an articulation which is full of excitement, full of energy. And that energy builds up through the body until you get to his upper torso, where he's pulled his right arm up and his left arm up, sort of raising his shoulders, and leans his whole body toward Adam and gestures with this restrained gesture, gathering force, the hand to me like a cobra pointing, and then that great empty gap, not empty because it's full of energy, full of emotion, but that space between God and Adam is so resonant, so remarkable, and Adam recoils from it in a comma, in a parenthesis. He pulls back. He's under a tree which is rather barren. Eden is gone indeed. And he points with his right hand under his left arm to Eve on the other side of the tree, shifting the blame to her, while she bends over still more. Look at the diagonal of the heads, following from God's head on down through Adam's to Eve's, this wonderful falling diagonal. And she covers her nakedness and in her shame. But in the ultimate buck passing, she points down to the tempter, to the serpent, to the demon at her feet, who, completely unyielding, flames back up at her. Well, it's utterly clear. The drama could not be more succinct, more effective, more memorable. It leaves you speechless with its succinctness and with its finality. A sense of finality. Could you write a better script? Could you envision a better script for this particular biblical narrative? Speaking of scripts, and moving from here to the end of the 11th century, away from the Ottonian Empire, we encounter one of the masterpieces of narrative art, an enthralling, embroidered history of the conquest of England by William the Conqueror in 1066. Though called the Bayeux Tapestry, this is in fact an embroidery nearly 225 feet long, though only about 20 inches high, that reads like a continuous cartoon strip. But this is narrative art of the highest order. Proof, if proof was needed, that seemingly naive art is often the subtlest, as well as the clearest, the most moving as well as the most delightful, and most importantly, the most memorable art. We're going to be looking at one scene here for a while, which I will identify and then describe later. It is some soldiers and horses at the Bay of Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy. The tapestry was begun just after the Battle of Hastings, 14 October 1066. And it was completed in time for exhibition in the nave of Bayeux Cathedral in Normandy, stretched around the nave, when it was consecrated in 1077. It was subsequently displayed, stretched around the nave on feast days and special occasions. The embroidery was certainly made in England, and it's the only great pictorial wall hanging that survives from the 11th century. You will sometimes in older literature see it called Queen Matilda's tapestry, William's queen, but no, she did not embroider it, and indeed it wasn't embroidered by women, but by men, almost certainly. Bayeux is near, as you probably know, near the site of the 1944 D-Day invasion. And of course, the so-called tapestry also represents an invasion, though of a different sort. It was probably commissioned by Bishop Odon, half-brother of William, Duke of Normandy. Odon accompanied him during the conquest, and Bishop Odon afterward rebuilt his cathedral at Bayeux, and so probably commissioned this work for it. The narrative of the Bayeux Tapestry is a statement about the need to respect an oath. Harold the Saxon had sworn an oath over sacred relics in the old cathedral of Bayeux, recognizing William's right to the English throne after the death of King Edward. He broke his oath, taking the crown for himself, and the invasion by William followed. The scene shows part of William's army with horsemen at the Bay of Mont Saint-Michel as they are nearing the ships that will take them to England. The famous Abbey of Mont Saint-Michel is in the center background of this particular detail, looking like a table on top of a tortoise. In the foreground, before I say more about the background, are the horses proceeding along the bay while the tide is out. But Mont Saint-Michel's bay is infamous for its sudden high tides, enormous tide shifts, and for its quicksands. And many pilgrims trying to reach Mont Saint-Michel died either in the tides or in the quicksand. And if you look at the horses here, they are crossing, suddenly the ground changes, and you realize the tidal area is changing. And then just at the right-hand side, you can see one horse who has fallen forward and is clearly going to be sinking into the quicksand. In the background, Mont Saint-Michel, as I was pointing out, looks like a table on top of a tortoise, but that's the way Mont Saint-Michel rises out of the bay, a great rock, not round-topped, but very pointed. And in fact, to build the abbey on top did require tremendous buttressing. They didn't have any reinforced concrete, but they had to build a shelf out wider than the top of the mount and support it with heavy buttressing. The artist here has come up with a simple and absolutely legible way of expressing that by turning it into a tabletop. And by the way, it's identified. All the way along, you have a script woven into it and put into the embroidery. And here it says Monte Michaelis. So you can read through this, and those who couldn't read could understand perfectly by the pictures they were looking at. Harold, as I said, broke his oath to William and assumed the throne of England. But now something ominous occurs, and astrologers come to Harold announcing the appearance of a comet, an evil omen for Harold. The comet is in the upper left-hand corner of this portion of the tapestry. It's labeled Stella, star, but in fact it is a fiery comet, and its significance, bad news, is being interpreted to Harold on his throne. It portends, of course, the coming invasion. But interestingly, historically, is that this comet is in fact Halley's Comet in the first recorded historical appearance of that comet. The kinds of surround that you see here, by the way, the little house for Harold, is borrowed from manuscript art and used here in this case for the embroidery. Here, horses are upended and killed in the Battle of Hastings. Unbelievable ferocity goes on throughout this, but I love this because of the horse literally standing upside down, head on his neck, and others pitching over, and people being tossed from their horses and being struck by spears. And in the lower ground below it, there are bodies strewn like footnotes at the bottom of this tapestry. The Bayeux Tapestry is one of the greatest pictorial narratives in Western European art, not because of technical sophistication, but because, like the Hildesheim door relief, in it all the artist's energy is focused on the most direct representation of a dramatic historical event. If this were a book, it would be a page-turner. You couldn't put it down. When it is viewed in its museum setting at Bayeux today, the visitor moves steadily and attentively along its great length, as enthralled by the visual chronicle as must have been the first Normans who saw it in the cathedral in 1077. Thank you for your attention.